Okay. Mm-hmm.
Hi everyone, welcome to another professional development seminar here at UAA. Thanks for joining us today. Today's presenter is Dr. Sebastian Neumayer. He is an assistant professor of computer engineering here at UAA. Dr. Neumayer received his PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from MIT. He also spent years working at MIT's Lincoln Laboratory in cybersecurity and information science. Today's talk is about security costs in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. So it's my honor to introduce Dr. Sebastian Neumayer.
Thanks for joining me here on this Friday. So today I'm going to be talking about Bitcoin and sort of the amount of energy that goes into Bitcoin use and what that's buying us. And so I'm really excited to give this talk because Bitcoin's been a hobby of mine for years. It's basically everything. Every hour I spend outside work here, I'm thinking about Bitcoin and just sort of there's all sorts of aspects that are super interesting. But one pretty interesting aspect to me is that Bitcoin uses about 1/4% of the world's electricity production, which is a pretty large amount of energy for a single sort of network that arguably may or may not get that much use currently. And so we're going to talk today about, well, how do we know it uses 1/4% of the world's energy production? And more importantly, why it's doing that. How did it get to this state? Like, what's being done? What exactly is where is this energy going? And so before we talk about any of that, I'm going to talk about what Bitcoin is and sort of where it's coming from in sort of regards to cash transactions or versus, say, digital like PayPal transactions. So where it fits in on that spectrum. Then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the details of how Bitcoin works. And so it uses something called proof of work. And that work is basically done here, and we'll show what computation is being performed using 1/4 of the world's energy power. And then we'll talk a little bit about the other types of waste in Bitcoin. So we also produce a lot of electronic waste. And so all that work, energy, and waste goes to do something. What does it do? Well, it really goes to help prevent what's called double spending in the Bitcoin network. So I'm going to talk about what double spending is and how we prevent it. And then I'm going to talk about other cryptocurrencies, because I'm sure you've heard there's Bitcoin, there's Bitcoin Cash, there's Ethereum, there's like 100 others. And so how much energy are they using if Bitcoin's using this enormous amount of energy? So we'll kind of put everything in perspective that way. We'll talk about other cryptocurrencies which don't use proof of work, which are sort of more, I'll call them green, in the sense that they don't waste energy. So proof of stake or proof of space, and other ideas for cryptocurrency mining we might see in the future. So you guys have probably heard of Bitcoin at some point by now. It's kind of a buzzword, this blockchain, Bitcoin, a lot of headlines. It's worth about $165 billion if you take the price times the amount of all Bitcoins in existence. There's quite a lot of money flying around out there in regard to this cryptocurrency. But because it's a digital currency and not a physical currency, well, security is going to be paramount when using it. And so if someone gives you a $10 bill, that's the end of the transaction because you just got the $10. There's no way for them to hack you or somehow take it back. The same's not true with Bitcoin. Someone can give you some digital currency. How do you know they didn't keep a copy of it? It's digital after all. And so can't you copy digital items? So we'll talk about that idea of spending a coin more than one time. And so the way I'm going to introduce Bitcoin here is the way it was introduced to the world. So in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto came out on a mailing list and says, I've been working on a new electronic cash system. that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party. So let's break that down a little bit. So he calls it an electronic cash system. Don't we already have those? Like I can Venmo, say, Mohammed, some $50. That's the electronic cash system. So why do we need Bitcoin? What's new about it? If I Venmo someone $50, I have to trust Venmo to actually process that transaction. We're going to talk about some of the drawbacks on having that third party. And if we go then a couple months later, Satoshi Nakamoto, he published the Bitcoin white paper, and the title was Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And so again, this word's electronic cash is appearing again. That's really what Bitcoin is. It's a cash version. It's money. It's cash like paying someone a $10 bill, but over the internet. This wasn't really possible on a wide scale before Bitcoin. So we can just briefly read the abstract. Again, purely peer-to-peer electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent from one party to another without going through a financial institution like a bank or like Venmo or like Visa. Digital signatures provide part of the solution, but main benefits are lost if you have to require that trusted third party. And here's the important part for this talk. Benefits are lost if a trusted third party is still required to prevent double spending. So what is double spending? We're going to talk about that. But that's, again, someone's going to use their coin more than one time. We propose a solution to this problem by using a peer-to-peer network. And the solution he proposes to this double spending problem is what's using 0.25% of the world's energy power right now. Okay, so let's take a step back. Let's say we have a red and green guy. The red guy is evil. They're going to do a cash transaction. So how does this work in real life? Well, the green guy is going to sell his gold or whatever he wants to sell, and they just meet and they swap items. It's pretty straightforward. We've all done something like this. This is a purely physical transaction. You're not using the internet here at all. So here, what does green protect himself against? Yeah, a counterfeit dollar bill. Exactly. Maybe red is going to beat him up too. You never know. What does red need to guard against? Same counterfeit gold, or maybe green's going to mug him and take the stuff back. And so the way you typically protect against this is if you want to protect yourself, you meet in a public place where you're unlikely, if there's some altercation or some problem, you can resolve it in a sort of civil manner. And provide some level of security meeting in a public place. So the problems are when accepting money at a cash transaction, how do you know that this money is authentic and not counterfeit when you accept that $100 bill? There's going to be like holograms and these weird stripes in the paper. I don't know what else they do, but there's all sorts of these countermeasures to prevent counterfeiting. So there's an important question, though. How do you know once you receive that $100 bill that it belongs to you and that no one else can have it? It's in your hand. It's in your pocket. So no one else can take it back. And so this is because a paper note can't be in two places at once. We're going to see in Bitcoin that's not exactly true because it's a sort of piece of data, and so you can copy data around. So that's a core problem in these digital currencies. Right, and what happens if someone tries to take their stuff back? Okay, so that's the purely physical world. Let's go to the purely digital world that we're sort of familiar with. We buy something on Amazon, so this is online. You give them your credit card information, but keep in mind, when you give them your credit card information, you're giving them a copy of it. So now your credit card information is in two places at once. Now Amazon, they have to use that information. They have to pass it along to Visa. Okay, now your information is in three places. Eventually, Visa says, okay, this is all good. And so what does green need to guard against here? Well, he needs to make sure that his goods are good, his goods are have arrived, but he also needs to make sure that Amazon doesn't sort of get hacked and his credit card information gets stolen. So that's kind of annoying. What does Amazon need to guard against? Well, really the same thing. They're liable if they lose this credit card information. They might be on the hook, or it's possible that that green guy is actually a red guy who stole green guy's credit card. Right? So they have to worry about all this fraud. So the type of things you need to be worried about is that, this credit card information is being passed around. That allows someone to spend money on your behalf. Also, implicitly in here is Visa has to approve every transaction. And so Visa is acting like a trusted third party. And we live in a country and in a time where we can basically buy anything we want. But sometimes Visa goes out and the Visa network goes down. Also, sometimes they censor our transactions. So there was a time where you could not donate to WikiLeaks with Visa. And it's because of this, when Visa stopped processing payments to WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks then began to accept Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin has no trusted third party. You can imagine if WikiLeaks was sitting right there, I could put a $10 bill and give it to them. Implicit in a cash transaction, there's no one in between. So you can give whoever you want Bitcoin. No one can stop that. And so that's what you gain by removing the trusted third party. And so here's how an idealized Bitcoin transaction would work. We have the red guy. He's going to give the Bitcoin to the green guy. Green guy is going to send over his gold or through the mail. Maybe it's a digital object like a Twitch subscription or some digital download. And the key here is that taking back that Bitcoin should be extremely difficult, even though it's a purely digital item. And so we ask the same questions for accepting Bitcoin. Can I trust that's authentic and not counterfeit? And can't digital cash be copied? How do I know no one else already owns that Bitcoin? And so basically the answers to this question are, the double spending problem has been solved. So how come this guy can't spend his Bitcoin more than one time? So we're going to go into details about how Bitcoin solves that problem. And so how does a double spending transaction work? Well, what it would look like, if you were the green guy, you'd receive the Bitcoin, you'd send over your goods. Okay, once you send over your goods, you're in trouble because this red guy, if he takes back the Bitcoin, you no longer have your goods, you no longer have your Bitcoin. You've been taken. So what red can do is he can send himself an alternate Bitcoin transaction. Now there's two Bitcoin transactions. Which one ends up in the final ledger? Well, if it turns out that second one ended up in the final ledger, the first one effectively never happened. Now red has gained everything. He has the Bitcoin and he has the item. Okay, so first, before I talk about how the mechanics of double spending, I want to talk about what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is basically a data structure, which is a linked list. So it's just a series of blocks. So here's a block. Bitcoin has about 500,000 blocks. Each block contains a sequence of transactions. And so in one of these transactions, say in block number 487,000, there's a transaction where red gave green some Bitcoin. That's one of many thousand transactions in that block. And so every 10 minutes, a new block is added to the Bitcoin blockchain. And that in each block contains the amount of transactions that have been sort of broadcast in the last 10 minutes. On average, every 10 minutes.
There's a sequence that's given.
Yeah, so these are in order. So this block builds on the previous block, and this block arrives 10 minutes after.
And there's a sequence in real time. Bitcoin time.
Yeah, so in 10 real minutes, there will be a new block added on top of that. It arrives sort of stochastically, but on average it arrives in 10 minutes. So the Bitcoin ledger is public. So this blockchain here of who owns what Bitcoin, That's public information, and there's interfaces to this information. So you can go on any website like blockchain.com Explorer, and you can say, oh, the last Bitcoin block arrived 5 minutes ago, and here's who mined it, and before that, it was 5 minutes before that, 13 minutes, 25 minutes. So this is all public, and you can go and explore these. And so you know when you receive Bitcoin because you will be able to see that if you're green, you can see that your transaction has been included in this public ledger. So not only do you see it, everyone else sees it, which is good news if you're green because now everyone in the world agrees that you have that Bitcoin. So now I want to talk a little bit about Bitcoin mining, which is how these blocks get created. So these blocks are created once every 10 minutes, like that. And so when a block gets created, the person who creates that block gets a reward. They are rewarded in Bitcoin. Right now they're getting rewarded 12.5 Bitcoin, which is about $130,000 on the open with the current market price. Well, that sounds awesome. Let's do this. Let's go mine. If we make a Bitcoin block, we get a fortune. Well, the thing is, Bitcoin mining is extremely difficult. And so only one block is created globally every 10 minutes. And there's a race. Whoever wins that race wins $130,000. So there's a lot of people trying to get that 12.5 Bitcoin. And there's so many people, and there's companies out there with racks of miners searching for the solution. So here's one of these miners. This is it's like an integrated, these are application-specific integrated circuits, ASICs. So this is basically a device that's been designed specifically to do one thing, to mine Bitcoin. And it takes, I think this one runs on about 1,300 watts. And there's warehouses full of these things all over the world. So there's looks like maybe 100,000 in there. Maybe a little bit less, I don't know. And so there's so many of them that globally there's a certain computation that's being performed called a hash, and there's 100 exahashes per second being computed. And one of those hashes every 10 minutes is going to win the next Bitcoin block. Now, okay, so let's go and break this down a little bit. So here's the latest state-of-the-art miner. This one is a couple years old, so it's actually worth nothing. It's garbage. So this latest one is called an S17. It performs one thing. It does one thing only. It performs a SHA-256 computation, which is a very specific sort of hashing function. It does 64 terahashes per second. And to put that in perspective, your computers run at sort of giga operations per second. So this is doing 1,000 times more operations per second than a computer, because it's been custom made to do that specifically. It takes about 3,000 watts. And it costs right now about $2,000 for a single unit. Okay, so you can look on the Bitcoin network right now, and you can see that we're mining. The total network hash rate is 100 exahashes per second. So that's the total amount of power going into the Bitcoin network in terms of computational power. Only one hash every 10 minutes will win. And our miner here, and so exahashes, we might have to review the prefixes because I hadn't heard of exahashes till recently once Bitcoin got there. So we have giga operations, that's how the computer is going to perform. 1,000 times above that, there's tera. 1,000 times above that, there's peta. And 1,000 times above that, there's exa. And then times 100, that's the amount of operations per second that Bitcoin is doing. But it's only doing one thing. It's just doing hashing. Okay, so we have 100 exahash. A standard miner, state-of-the-art one, would be performing about 64 terahashes, which means that there's about 1.5 million of these machines worldwide doing Bitcoin mining. Oops, that's not good. Well, if they each use 2,800 watts, then that tells us there's about, at a lower bound, at the absolute sort of minimum case, there's 4.5 gigawatts going into Bitcoin mining worldwide. And that's a lot. That's getting up there. I think that's on the order of a small nuclear power plant or something. We can go from the opposite end. So we have a lower bound. Can we get an upper bound? We kind of can. So assume that the entire amount of mining cost is going into electricity. Well, how much do people spend on mining? Well, you can give the upper bound for that. We know a block's found every 10 minutes. And each block that's found yields a reward of 12.5 Bitcoin. And each Bitcoin is worth $9,000. And assuming a conservative cost that energy is 5 cents per kilowatt hour, we can do a computation, and this gives the upper bound that Bitcoin uses no more than 12 gigawatts. So it's somewhere between 4 and 12. Just as this is the back of the envelope calculation. And people have done studies, and there's a website. This is the Cambridge Bitcoin Energy Consumption Index website, and they find that it's probably more around the order of 8. It's somewhere between the upper and lower bound. And so let's put that in perspective. That's on par with Austria. So Bitcoin mining is using as much power as a small country. This is completely absurd. Like, so what's going on here? Why is so much energy going into this? Okay, and it's even worse than that, okay? Because each block that Bitcoin produces can contain almost 4,000 transactions. And Bitcoin has capped itself at this block technical, or some various reasons. But this means that the Bitcoin network can process 7 transactions per second globally. That's not very high. I think Visa can handle, during Christmas time, they can do something like 10,000 transactions per second. So this is just a fraction of Visa's capacity. Well, if you do the math on this means $15 of electricity is being used for each Bitcoin transaction. That's not a very good metric. However, I do want to qualify that, saying that this per transaction cost would go down if Bitcoin did decide to, say, raise their block size and include more transactions in a block. But still, $15 per transaction just in raw electricity cost is not great. Why are they doing this? What's going on here? How did, So let's go back and remember, so we have this blockchain, it's growing. It's going to have a transaction that's important to us. Say that we receive some Bitcoin. And so about $100,000 worth of energy is going into producing each block. So each of these blocks just takes an enormous amount of energy to produce. And again, we know this because only one is found every 10 minutes. And there's an entire network of warehouses with these machines trying to find these. Okay, so what's going on here? So first I want to talk about what these machines are actually doing. And so what is the Bitcoin mining puzzle? And so they're trying to find a hash of some number that's less than a target value. So what does that mean? So there's this function called a hash function, which basically chooses random numbers. And so I'm going to go to this website that does hashing. And so here, where'd it go? So here, every time I press a space, it generates a new hash. See that? I'm just pressing space, and new numbers are appearing down there. And this is the hash of a certain number of spaces. So we're taking the SHA-256 of a certain number of spaces to get this number. And so this is all Bitcoin miners are doing. They're just basically pressing this number on a keyboard until some condition is met. So I'm going to do a hashing puzzle, and I want to find it. So this number here has a single leading 0. This is written in hex. So on average, I have to press this button about 16 times. So I'll go a little slower so I can see it. Haven't won. I didn't win. It starts with 6. I didn't win. It starts with 5. Did not win. It starts with 8. C, 1. I'll get there eventually. 3, 5, 6, 3. E, A, 2. But you see how it's a random process? And eventually, 1 out of every 16 times, I'm going to win. Hopefully sometime soon. Okay, there we go. We just won. So I just won the next Bitcoin block. So if I tell everyone about the string I just threw in, and I tell everyone about it, everyone's going to build on my block, and I'd get $100,000 if the Bitcoin mining difficulty just required me to get a single leading 0. But it doesn't require me to get a single leading 0 because the amount of button presses that are occurring worldwide is 100 exa button presses per second, which is very large. And so what's going on there is basically the miners are throwing darts at a board, and most of the time they're going to lose, but occasionally they're going to win, and they're going to broadcast their block. And they can do no better than just throwing darts at the board. They can't save their work from before. Each time is a random draw. But in Bitcoin, the chances of winning are very small. So small that the leading zeros of the latest block hashes is not just 1, but I think there's about 20 leading, or 18 leading zeros. So that means you need to try for 16 to the 18th times before you find a winning hash. Okay, so what's going on here? The longest chain in Bitcoin is the one that's considered valid. Let's see. So what can happen is 2 miners find a solution at the exact same time. Well, now which one do miners choose to build on? Well, they might choose to build on the top one, and this means that this block here is orphaned and is no longer in consensus. And so it's as if this miner never got his reward. And so he's really upset because he just got $100,000, and there's a special transaction in there that pays him his 12.5 Bitcoin. But it turned out that this upper chain won. And so if you look at the history of all transactions here through this top one, what did not get included is the transaction where this miner got 12.5 Bitcoin. So if you get orphaned, it's as if it never happened. And so what can happen, 2 miners publish blocks at the same time. If there was more mining power on the top block than the second block, it's more likely that the top chain would be extended, which means that this bottom chain never happened. Okay. Oops. Okay, so let's go back to double spending. So how does this help with double spending? Because Bitcoin, after all, in the abstract, it claims to solve this double spending problem, which hadn't been solved in digital currencies beforehand that. And so remember, it's this red guy. He's going to release a second transaction that spends the same coin. And somehow he's going to reverse the first transaction. So what's the mechanism how that would happen? Okay. This green guy receives a Bitcoin. So the red guy publishes the transaction. It's going to be included in a block. So after 10 minutes, this block is produced by the Bitcoin miners. A couple more blocks are produced. Okay, now green thinks this is great because in the sort of ledger, he has his Bitcoin. Now the key here is that in Bitcoin, the longest chain is considered valid. And so what can happen is in secret, the red guy, if he controls a large fraction of the mining power, well, he can create his own blocks. And he can do this in secret. And if he gets a longer chain than the top chain, then if he releases that, now all of a sudden everyone's going to be mining on the longer chain because this is the one that's considered valid. Well, if this is considered valid, that means the top chain is not valid. Well, that's really bad for our green guy because what's in the top chain? In the top chain is the transaction where red gave green the Bitcoin. So that's no longer in history. And now this is history. which means that red gave himself Bitcoin. He did not give green any Bitcoin. And so basically, if it's easy for the attacker to make blocks and outpace the main chain, he's going to be able to rewrite history whenever he wants. And so it's good for the security of Bitcoin if these blocks are very hard for the attacker to create. And so the current security of the Bitcoin network is very high because right now it takes about $100,000 of electricity just to create a block. So if someone were to try to steal Bitcoin, well, they'd have to create about a couple blocks of their own. And so the current practice in Bitcoin is once you receive a Bitcoin, you don't consider it yours until it's been included in a block, and then 5 blocks are built on top of it. So here's the block that contains the transaction. 5 more blocks have occurred over time. They're going to arrive randomly. And then you can be reasonably certain that no one's going to rewrite history because, history has been kind of settled by that point. Because the attacker would have to go back 5 blocks and rewrite them. And creating 5 blocks is really hard. And so it's the difficulty of creating these blocks that gives Bitcoin its security. So let's say the attacker, we've waited 5 blocks and the attacker has only found 1 block so far. Well, the main chain is going to keep growing at a pretty high rate because the attacker only has a small fraction of the hash power. Because remember, he has to beat this main chain. And so the chances of him finding the next block are each time 20%. And so you can calculate the probability of him finding sort of 5 blocks in a row. It's just 20% to the 5th power. And that's something negligible, like 0.03%. So the attacker here has a 0.03% chance of beating the main chain. And implicit in here is the attacker probably wouldn't even try this in the first place because every block that he creates on his chain that will probably get orphaned is a block he didn't create on the main chain, which would guarantee him $100,000. And so what's important here is that the main chain is growing faster than the attacker chain, and that these blocks are hard to create. And you can do this as sort of quantitative analysis. You can see, well, after you wait a certain number of transactions, say 5 transactions, and the attacker has, say, 20% of the hash power, you can double spend a 4% probability. And so here, if I give you $1 in Bitcoin, and I told you there's a 3% chance it could be taken back from you, would you be okay with that? Maybe. It's maybe not worth standing around for an hour. What happens if someone gave you $10 or $1 million? All of a sudden, if someone gave you $1 million and you want to make sure that they didn't steal $1 million of gold bars from you, well, 4% is probably not going to cut it. You're probably going to want to wait 5, 7, maybe 10 blocks. And the more blocks you wait, the more that history has been settled, the less likely it is to be rewritten. And so there's a certain cost here. You have to wait for the finality of the transaction before you can really be certain it's settled. And so here, let's go back to our original question. How do we know that money is authentic and not counterfeit? Well, you can always just look at the public ledger in Bitcoin. So there's no such thing as a counterfeit Bitcoin, which is really cool. But there's the other problem is how can I make sure that no one else claims this money belongs to them and not to me? That is, how can I be sure it's not been double spent? And basically the answer there is to wait for a fixed number of blocks to be built on your transaction. And when you do that, you ensure that it's very hard for the attacker to go back in history because they have to start writing blocks. They'd have to create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 blocks of their own and beat the longest this chain in order to rewrite history. And creating each block, the harder it is to create a block, the harder it is to pull off this attack. And the security of Bitcoin right now is set up in such a way that each block is just massively difficult to create. So let's talk about that difficulty. It wasn't always this difficult. It's only become difficult because Bitcoin's worth so much. Because remember, the miners are getting paid in Bitcoin. So in Bitcoin, when it came out, was worth nothing. So no one was mining on it back in, say, 2010. But as Bitcoin became worth more, people were more interested in mining it. But the more people who mined it, the more secure Bitcoin is, because the harder it is to create blocks, the less chance you have of being sort of double spent against. And so there's this a virtuous cycle of security and price, at least in the early days. And so initially they started just mining with sort of regular computers. Then they moved up to graphics cards, which were more efficient. Then they went to FPGAs. And finally they went to full custom silicon here. So this is not a computer, a general purpose computer. It just has chips built in it specifically fabbed for pressing, doing SHA-256, which is when I was tabbing that space on the keyboard. That's all that thing does, in probably 1,000,000 times more efficiently than a general purpose computer. And so how fast has this difficulty risen? Well, it constantly surprises me. So this is just in the last couple weeks. Bitcoin retargets its difficulty every 2 weeks. And so in the last difficulty adjustment, it became 5% harder to mine Bitcoin. 2 weeks before that, it was 2% harder to mine Bitcoin. 2 weeks before that, the difficulty went up 10%. And so a machine that is producing 10 Bitcoin now, 6 months from now, might only be producing 5 Bitcoin per day. And so this increased difficulty is a result of the increase in price, which means that it's harder to create blocks, so that gives security against double spending again. But it's hard to create blocks for both the attacker and the honest miners. But that's not just the only waste that's going on here. So this made money maybe a couple years ago, but the difficulty has gone up 10x since then. So this is now worthless. If I had like electricity at like 2 kilowatt hours, 2 cents per kilowatt hour, this is probably not profitable anymore. And so you have millions of these miners that basically can't do anything else but mine Bitcoin, but they're not profitable at mining Bitcoin, and so they're just junk. And so there's a video here of some miners throwing away their old equipment. You can just see how many of them there are. It's just sort of, the waste is incredible on multiple scales here. So how much waste is there? So there's no easy way to verify this, but there's some sources out here that say we're at about 11 kilotons per year, which puts us at the waste of a small country. And if you do a per transaction analysis, one Bitcoin transaction is it's the same as saying it's about one C-size battery in terms of electronic waste. Pretty bad. And so that's just Bitcoin. If you go look at charts, there's Ethereum, there's Bitcoin Cash, there's Litecoin, and about 100 others. So hopefully they're not generating as much waste as Bitcoin. Well, it turns out they're not, because they're worth less money. So the market cap of Ethereum, sort of the issuance of Ethereum, isn't quite as high as Bitcoin in pure dollar terms, which means that it's less effective to mine because the miners get paid in the currency itself. So if you run the numbers, so there's papers that look into this. So they say for Ethereum, you could have about 750,000 households powered by Ethereum if instead you switched over from mining. And this is about 0.04% of the world's energy consumption. Still not good. And so where is this going in the future? This is a known drawback of all these cryptocurrencies, is all this proof of work and wasted effort just to really effectively press a space bar on a computer just to make sure everyone agrees on history. And so there's other types of mechanisms for consensus which don't rely on wasted computational effort. And so there's something called proof of stake, where the idea is whenever there's sort of contention between history, like, so is this block going to make it into long-term history, or is this block going to make it into long-term history? Well, instead of finding it out via a computational puzzle, what people have tried to do is say people that own the coins themselves will, in essence, vote on the next block. And so it's the holders of the currency rather than these miners exogenous to the network, which are going to determine the history. And so here, the people that sort of have the money would are more likely to produce the next block. But this has its own drawbacks because now it's free. If you have some coins, maybe you can, it kind of gets into some game theory stuff, but you can launch some like long-range attacks where maybe enough people with money can then go and rewrite history, say 10 or 20 blocks back. Because these blocks are free to mine once you have the money. So if you get a bunch of your friends together, maybe you can go rewrite history way back when. And so there's lots of sort of game theory problems with this proof of stake mechanism. It's been tried before, so there's a couple cryptocurrencies out there. Purecoin was the first cryptocurrency to try this. Other sort of ideas, instead of just producing all this electronic waste to do the mining, what happens if you instead have the mining related to actual physical hardware that is useful? So there's this permacoin idea, which is a proof of retrievability. And so basically you have to have a rack of hard drives, and you're going to have some data to store. This is going to be useful data to store. It's kind of a distributed data storage mechanism. And if you can prove that you can quickly retrieve that data, that is that you have proof of retrievability, then you're going to be able to mine on that cryptocurrency. So this way you're not producing sort of irrelevant hardware. At least the hardware you're investing in is useful for something else. And then there's another idea. Instead of just doing these random hashes, what happens if you do a puzzle that's still hard, but is still kind of useful? And so there's prime, as an example of that, there's prime coin. And so you can find chains of prime numbers, which have some property. Now, you can argue whether that's useful or not, but it's something that people have tried instead of using Bitcoin's SHA-256 mining algorithm. And then finally, a lot of these warehouses produce a lot of heat. So for example, this thing is 2,800 watts. It's extremely loud, and it also is extremely warm. And so you can imagine if you have racks of these, you might not just want to let that heat go outside. And so what some people have thought about doing is sort of using this and pumping that waste heat out into greenhouses, or heating your house within the winter. Or you can have a Bitcoin mining toaster. When you put in your Pop-Tart, it's going to mine Bitcoin to heat up the Pop-Tart. But that doesn't exist yet. So that's really it. The future of Bitcoin mining is going to be interesting. See where it goes. Because right now, I will make the final comment that there's been such a dramatic increase in the difficulty of mining Bitcoin, because initially it started with general purpose computers, then it went into GPUs, then more advanced custom silicon. And in just a couple years, they built custom silicon, and now we're on sort of the latest process node. So we're at the state of the art. Basically, Bitcoin miners don't have that much more room to sort of get more efficient. And so maybe the level field will start getting a little bit more even. We'll start seeing some more like household mining devices. So we'll see maybe something like this is in the future. So that's all.
How did the warehouse get reimbursed for that energy?
So the question was, how do the warehouses get reimbursed for the energy of mining Bitcoin? So I think different miners will have different setups, but ultimately they're going to have to pay for the power somehow. And so what basically happens is the miners get paid in Bitcoin. They take the Bitcoin that they got from mining, and they go to and they sell it on markets. So you can just go to, say, Coinbase, deposit your Bitcoin there, sell it for 1 Bitcoin at whatever the current rate is. So if they find a block, they'd go and sell it for $100,000. Then they take that $100,000 and then pay whoever they owe money to for the electricity in dollars or whatever currency that they have to pay their bills in. Yeah.
When it's not, becomes not economic for them to mine Bitcoins anymore, then how much energy is being used at that point with this transaction?
So the question is, when Bitcoin mining doesn't become economical anymore for the larger miners, what's the future going to be like?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to understand the energy usage of mining versus the energy usage of Bitcoins being used in transactions.
I see. Well, the amount of energy going into Bitcoin mining has been pretty variable over the years. So just even a couple years ago, compared to now, it's probably an order of magnitude. But the amount of transactions is roughly the same. It's been capped at about 7 transactions per second. And so as the amount of energy going into Bitcoin mining varies, but the amount of transactions in the Bitcoin network stays the same, the amount of sort of energy per transaction is going to sort of fluctuate. But then looking forward, I didn't really discuss this, but every 4 years, the reward that the miners get is halved. And so in I think next year they have the next halving. So instead of getting paid 12.5 Bitcoin, the miners receive 6.5 Bitcoin. And so over time, the reward is going to decrease. And so the amount of energy that they're likely going to be willing to spend on mining Bitcoin is going to go down unless they can be compensated via transaction fees or some other mechanism. And so we'll see that sort of energy per transaction change over the years, certainly.
I don't know if I asked my question properly. There's a certain amount of energy going into mining all the time. That's what you told us about at the start.
Mm-hmm.
That includes all the energy that's used in mining and transactions. And what I'm trying to understand is, if they stop mining today, how much energy will continue to be used just in the usage of Bitcoins?
I see. So I think
I'm trying to separate the two out, or maybe you can't separate them out. If you're telling me if they stop mining, the whole thing falls apart.
yeah, that's right. So the question is like, what's the difference in the energy between producing blocks to mine Bitcoin and the energy going in to sort of processing the transactions? So they're actually one and the same thing, because what the miners do is they produce blocks, and that's where all their energy is going. But each block contains transactions, and they're incentivized to do so because they get a little bit of money for doing that.
You're saying that eventually it's going to not be useful for them to do it. They won't be able to make any money.
That's right, because their reward that they're going to receive is going to go down to zero.
They're going to stop mining, and then what's going to happen?
Well, they may not stop mining, because if there's enough transactions in the block, and each transaction gives them, say, $10, and there's thousands of transactions in that block, they still might be receiving a $100,000 reward for finding this block. Fees replace going to be just as much energy going into Bitcoin mining 10 years from now as there is today. But it's not clear. As of right now, the transaction fees, the tips per each transaction, is not going to cover the Coinbase reward, the fixed reward. Is that?
Sort of. You're getting closer, I think, to what I was trying to ask.
So if the miners stop producing blocks today, and they just all walked home, then there'd be no new blocks produced. If there's no new blocks produced, that means that no transactions would effectively occur. Because what would never get included in any block is my transaction. So I'm waiting for a block that includes my transaction. But if that block is never produced, well, I never.
Mining is required in order to make this whole system.
Yes. Because that's what prevents the double spending in Bitcoin, which is really the core problem it's trying to solve.
Do you know how much energy is used in conventional currency?
No, I don't. But there's a lot of ways to measure it, because do you include like the office buildings and like the waste going into all the printing presses and all that stuff. But I don't know how large that is.
So it's limited at what, 7 transactions a second?
Yeah.
Who sets that rule, or how is that kept, or will that change?
That is an excellent question, and that has been the source of a lot of debate within the Bitcoin community in the last couple of years. In fact, that group of people decided the 1 megabyte block size. So right now in Bitcoin, each block size is limited to 1 megabyte, which means it can only fit a couple thousand transactions. Now, there's a group of people, and there was such a demand to get into a block that a couple years ago, the tips that the people were paying to get into a block were going upwards of $50. And so there's a lot of pressure like in the Bitcoin community to increase this block size. But for various reasons, basically you can argue that keeping the block size small will keep Bitcoin decentralized, which is the entire point of Bitcoin. So there's a group of people that wants to keep it small. There's another smaller faction of the community that want to increase the block size in order to not have transaction fees be so large, so it's now feasible to pay someone $1 in Bitcoin. So that community broke off, and that's now called Bitcoin Cash. That's like the 4th largest cryptocurrency on that list.
So I'm pretty ignorant of Bitcoin generally. I can see how it's like an interesting technical curiosity, sort of. But if I'm the green guy, I don't really see why I would prefer this over using like a credit card, because a credit card, by law, those transactions are protected. So even if it did get hacked, I'm not at risk personally.
Right.
So I realize that Visa might have an interest in it, but why?
Right. That's an excellent question. So the question is, well, I talked earlier about sort of when you use Visa cards on Amazon, it's typically not a problem for the green guy because Visa has chargeback protection. So if Amazon loses the data or something, they can get their money back. But with Bitcoin, there's no getting your money back. That doesn't exist. And so what's the advantage for the green guy to pay with anything in Bitcoin? And one of the reasons you may in the future, this currently doesn't happen, but in order to get money for that chargeback if someone made a sort of fraudulent charge on your card, well, the payment processor, the person accepting the credit card transaction, has to pay a fee to Visa for accepting the credit card transaction. I forget what it is. It's like a 1% fee or maybe a fixed 25-cent fee or something. Whereas if you use Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash or something with a small fee, you wouldn't have to pay that fee. And so just like you can ask for a cash discount sometimes, you can do the same thing maybe with Bitcoin because they don't have to pay that sort of chargeback insurance fee. So.
You think with our $22 trillion debt, is that the future? Or do you think we're going to continue to focus on our currency that I don't know how valuable that is?
So the question is, how does this interface with our $22 trillion debt? I don't know. It's kind of it's outside the scope of my sort of my interest in Bitcoin, and I think just time will tell how this will all play into it. I will mention though something I did not mention here is Bitcoin has a fixed number of fixed supply cap, which means over time, because the miners get paid less and less, it's exponentially decreasing, which means that there's only going to be 21 million Bitcoin that ever come into existence. And maybe I will briefly mention that I think in time they're going to break that $21 million limit, because what's going to happen is right now, once it becomes the miners are getting paid anything for producing a block because all the Bitcoins have run out, they still are going to want to get paid. And if they don't get paid, they're going to leave. And if the miners leave the network, there's no more security in Bitcoin, and people are going to start double spending against exchanges. And then there's going to be something that there's basically going to increase the issuance of Bitcoin in the name of security is what I think is going to happen maybe in a decade or two. So I do think we'll see inflation and permanent inflation in Bitcoin. Yeah.
You said the whole purpose of Bitcoin is to remove third parties, but wouldn't the miners and Coinbase itself be a third party itself?
Absolutely, because the miners are the ones who have to approve the transaction, and that's why I put up here a star, kind of. Now, it's a little bit better than having a single third party, because worldwide, the people producing these blocks, the person producing the next block gets to choose what transaction goes in there. As long as there's a single miner worldwide willing to include your transaction at some point in the future, that miner will eventually produce a block which contains your transaction, which means that in some sense you don't have to worry about that censorship on your transaction, because it will eventually, as long as all the miners aren't against you, you'll get your transaction in. But the miners are effectively acting as a third party here. That's right.
So if there is no other question, please join me in the reminder.
Thank you.